Demonic possession is a tale as old as time. Records indicate that haunting, demons, and witchcraft have always seemed to plague humanity. You can find tales of the supernatural in nearly every society. One recent study even claimed that out of 488 societies worldwide, 74% believe in possession by spirits. With so many stories of haunting, it's hard to know what's true and what isn't. So today, here at Unexplained Mysteries, we'll be taking a look at 3 famous ghost stories. The Old Arnold Estate. Burrowville, Rhode Island is a quiet village. With a population of just 1,600, it's a setting for any American family looking to connect with nature. That's exactly what Carolyn and Roger Perrin thought they would get when they moved their 5 young daughters into a gorgeous estate in 1970. Unfortunately, their peaceful expectations were far from the truth. Almost immediately, something strange seemed to be going on in their new house. Things didn't seem to stay where you left them, and if you weren't careful, they would go missing entirely. Carolyn, the matriarch, seemed to have had it the hardest. Her broom had a mind of its own. It would travel around the house when no one was looking and sweep small piles of dirt onto newly cleaned floors. Both Carolyn and her daughters experienced strange nighttime visions where figures would hover over them or items of furniture would burst into flames. They did their best to forget these small issues and blamed it on dreams or perhaps forgetfulness and attempted to go on living a normal life. But things continued to pile up. The girls' hair was pulled by invisible hands, and the antique bottles the family collected were constantly rearranged. The telephone and other appliances always seemed to be inoperative. Flies swarmed the house, coming from no discernible source. It seemed that something, or someone, wanted to make their presence known. Carolyn decided to research the town's history, believing it might provide some insight into the mysterious events on their estate. Reports indicated before the Perrins arrived, 8 generations of the same family lived in that house, and many of them had died there too. In the 1800s, a woman named Bethesda lived there. She had a reputation for witchcraft, and her children always seemed to die mysteriously as infants. After Carolyn's research, the hauntings grew more violent. Pots of frying meat flew off the stove while cooking. Cindy, one of the middle children, was trapped in a wooden box in the shed during a routine game of hide and seek. The parents were sure that Bethesda was to blame, and word spread. The famous ghost hunting couple, that we've spoken about a few times on this channel, Ed and Lorraine Warren, came to investigate. Having heard of the house's power, the Warrens travelled to Rhode Island to investigate and conduct a séance. If the story so far sounds familiar, it's probably because it is. The 2013 movie The Conjuring was based off of the Perrin family's real-life experience. However, after the arrival of the Warrens, things went a little bit differently from the movie. Carolyn was supposedly possessed during the séance. She contorted and shook wildly. But even after the Warrens supposedly de-demonized her, the family continued to experience unexplained torment. To add insult to injury, they couldn't afford to leave. They'd exhausted all of their resources. Financially, they had no choice but to stay in the house until 1980. In 1980, they moved to Georgia. Although they left many of the spirits behind, including Bethesda, they weren't completely lucky. Andrea, the oldest Perrin daughter, later wrote that the spirits of Rhode Island Estate seemed to grow rather attached to the family. They seemed to follow them wherever they went. The Demon House. This story is much more recent. It takes place in the time of cell phones, Wi-Fi, and constant connectivity. Yet despite all that technology, there's still mystery in the world. In 2011, LaToya Ammons, her mother Rosa, and her 3 young children moved into a house on Carolina Street in Gary, Indiana. They were greeted by an unfortunate welcome. Black flies seemed to swarm the porch. Despite the chilly December air, the family brushed it off at first. However, the flies kept returning despite all efforts to kill them off. This was only the first sign of what was to come. March 10th, 2012 was a seemingly normal day. The family had hosted some friends for dinner, and the festivities had gone on into the night. The friends decided to stay over and head home in the morning. At around 2 a.m, the quiet house was suddenly filled with an ear-rending scream. It was coming from the room of LaToya's oldest daughter, who was just 12 years old. LaToya, Rosa, and their guests rushed to the room, where they were met by a terrifying sight. The young girl was levitating above the bed, screaming, completely incapacitated. She seemed unable to respond, trapped in a terrifying nightmare. Rosa began to pray over the girl's body, and she eventually descended and regained consciousness, but had no memory of the event. From there, the hauntings only seemed to grow more intense. LaToya constantly heard heavy footsteps ascending the basement stairs and rattling the door from the basement to the kitchen. Shadowy figures would pace the living room at night, but when the family switched on the lights, wet footprints were all that was left behind. One night, LaToya's son was thrown across the room by a powerful force. Although he wasn't injured, LaToya and Rosa knew they had to do something to protect the children. On April 19th, just more than a month after the levitation, LaToya contacted their family doctor, who visited the house but didn't witness any paranormal activity. LaToya also hired a Catholic priest to perform an exorcism, which took place 3 days later on April 22nd. The priest visited the home, interviewed the family, and concluded that they were being haunted by as many as 200 demons. He conducted 3 exorcisms on the family, but even that didn't seem to help. LaToya's youngest son crawled backwards and rolled his eyes back into his head, seemingly possessed. Her daughter felt a presence choking her. All 3 children heard terrifying messages about dying. Finally, in May of 2012, enough was enough. After less than a year in the house and 2 months of intense haunting, the Ammons family left. Little is known about their whereabouts today, but online sources confirm that leaving the house seemed to stop the haunting. The house itself was empty for 2 years until 2014, when it was purchased by filmmaker Zach Bagans. The house itself sat empty for 2 years until 2014, when it was purchased by a filmmaker. He filmed a documentary called Demon House about the inhabitants. After he was done filming, he demolished the house, hoping to bury the demons with it. Today, the plot of land sits empty and untouched. The documentary may have been successful, but still, no family will live on that spot on Carolina Street ever again. The Taylor's Devils. The year was 1787. The place was Yatton, Somerset County, England. Today, this village is a normal-seeming town, with a central square, a railroad station, and a number of cafes and shops. In the 18th century, however, it was the location of a frightening occurrence, one that set the stage for modern demonic possession as we know it. George Lukins was a tailor by training, but he had made his living as a common carrier. Today, we would call this a messenger. He also dabbled in ventriloquism and singing, and he acted in the church's annual Christmas pageant. He was well known by his neighbours and was in good standing with the church. However, George was also a troubled man. From at least 1769, he'd experienced unusual seizures, or fits as they were called at the time. George claimed these seizures began when he was knocked over by a divine slap while performing a church pageant. These unusual fits caused George to sing and scream in an inhuman voice, act violently, and even bark like a dog. In 1775, he spent nearly 6 months in a local hospital, but he was ultimately declared incurable and released. For a few years in the late 1770s, George's seizures seemed to slow down, and he could live a relatively normal life. Unfortunately, in 1787, his fits returned with a vengeance. More than ever before, he was overcome by strange episodes of agitations, violence, and fear. George began to suspect something dark was at play, demonic possession. Like Mary Magdalene, George believed he was possessed by 7 demons, which only 7 priests could drive out. On May the 31st of that year, he experienced a violent fit in front of members of the clergy. Horrified, they called the local vicar, who interviewed George and declared an exorcism was necessary. Through a combination of singing and prayer, George's demons were cast out. Historic records indicate that George's seizures seemed to slow down after the exorcism, and the man himself seemed content and happy. Whether or not he was troubled by demonic possession after the exorcism, he was able to live out his life as a happy man. The stories we've explored today span continents, religion, and hundreds of years. Yet all of them have unusual things in common. Despite all the advancements of today's society, we may never truly understand where these stories come from, and how much of them are rooted in truth. So what do you make of these mysterious hauntings? Be sure to let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and help us by growing this community, whilst working to solve these unexplained mysteries. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos.